I'm just muted.
All right, everybody, welcome to an interesting topic we have tonight for a virtual Zoom meeting with our club, following a recent listening session where people were debating how live music should sound in our own rooms and what the impact is of the recording itself and the room and all the other parameters that affect the overall fidelity and presentation. Before starting, I want to thank both John Shate and Gary Eckmeyer for making brief presentations available. And we'll lead with John, followed by Gary. I have a little poll I want to launch, first of all, here, just to get some feedback from everybody about how happy they are with their systems currently. So let me go ahead and launch this poll. If you all can answer. The people that are co-hosts, both John, Gary, and myself, cannot respond to a poll, but everybody else can. I'll just wait a moment longer for everybody to respond. Okay. And everybody has responded who's able to. And this is the results. Can you all see that? So interesting. 2 people think it's perfect. 5 say it's great, but not quite there. And somebody thinks it's just okay, and somebody thinks it's just good. So we all have different perspectives on chasing our audio nirvana and where we're at. So interesting. Just to give us a little perspective on where we're coming from. And Tony, you got your hand up already.
Yeah, so there was a choice that wasn't there that really I think might be like I'm one of the people who picked it's perfect. And I believe it is, short of like it is perfect such that you're not going out of your way to find anything new to put in your system. But technology moves along, new things come out, somebody might ask you to try something, and where you go, you know what, yeah, this makes a little bit of an enhancement to what I already have that you wouldn't have otherwise gone after, short of not having known about it. So I mean, if that includes everything I just said, then that's that counts as perfect.
So basically what you're saying is it's perfect when you have stepped off the upgrade path.
Correct. So
okay,
that's short of you're not actively pursuing upgrades.
Right. That's a good way to define it. I would agree with that. All righty. Well, let's go ahead, move along. Thank you for that perspective. And I'll turn it over to John to give his presentation, followed by some questions and answers. And again, for any latecomers, please raise your hand if you'd like to speak, but otherwise keep your mic muted. Okay, John.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks for having me. And I always like doing these slideshows. To me, they're really interesting. Different things you learn about audio that you didn't really know. And also, I want to thank Mike for having that meeting, because that was just a great system and just a lot of camaraderie and good music. So that was fantastic. But I didn't realize it was going to spur all that comment over on Meetup. Which is also very interesting, and I know that there's kind of 2 factions here. One says leave the recording alone, leave the pristine recording alone, and other ones are like, I want to make my room sound good and add to the actual recording with what I do to my system. So I just want to go over a little bit of what the recordings really are, because some people don't realize that these recordings aren't as great as you think they are. And a lot of times they're recorded for the car. At the same time, they're recorded for the house. At the same time, they're recorded for the headphones. So it's hard to get a consistency across the board. So I could start the show. And now, if you can hold any questions until I get done with the slides, I appreciate it. So we're going to start out wire recordings so inconsistent. And it is amazing that we can get our high-end audio systems to do a decent job with how different the recordings are engineered. The audio Floyd Tools audio circle of confusion is what we'll talk about, and then we'll talk about some real interesting monitor loudspeakers that are very, very common, and they're not the greatest, called the Yamaha NS10s. And then we'll talk about a little bit about the loudness wars, and Bob Katz is responsible for that. And then we'll go into Francis Rumsey, and he wrote a book called Spatial Audio that I highly recommend if you haven't, if you're looking for a book to read. And then we'll look at a little major studio DSP processing by J.J. French. So here's Floyd. Whether you like him or not, it's Floyd. He has a lot of money behind him, and he did studies for Harman. So he definitely has some credentials, and he's a very smart guy. And he came up with this circle of confusion years and years ago, and I'll go into it now a little bit of what it is. So the recordings start out with microphones, equalization, ambience, and other effects, and they're evaluated using 2 monitor loudspeakers that are evaluated with recordings that are used as test signals to subjectively evaluate loudspeakers. So this big circle is created, and then you have the loudness wars, where some of these recordings are redone, and they're redone at a large amount of increase in volume, because that's what sells. Increase in volume is what they found out, that's what sells. So you have this big circle, and one depends on the other, which depends on the other. So you'll get all kinds of crazy results with the recordings, because there is no consistency across the board. And here it is spelled out a little more. And basically I went over everything in it, and he said both the creation of the art of the recording and its reproduction, the loudspeakers in room, are trapped in this interdependent circular relationship where the quality of one depends on the quality of another. Since the playback chain and room through which recordings are monitored are not standardized, the quality of recordings remain highly variable. The biggest variability in the recordings is the bass. I mean, I know everyone realizes that, man, that's too much bass in that recording, or man, I wish there was a little more bass in that recording. So the variability, the biggest thing is the bass and variability. But also in high frequency, some are more forward. Some you can't even listen to if you wanted to, and some of these are really some of your favorite music when you're a kid. You want to listen to it. So, but it depends on the recording, if they're forward or if they're tubby, or if they don't have any bass at all. So circle of confusion, more of this is a random sampling of one's own music library will quickly confirm that the variation in sound quality that exists among different music recordings, apart from audible differences in dynamic range, spatial imagery, and noise and distortion. The spectral balance of recordings can vary dramatically in terms of their brightness, and particularly the quality and quantity of bass, which we just said. Magnitude of these differences suggests that something other than variations in artistic judgment and good taste is at the root of the problem. Most likely culprits are the loudspeakers in rooms through which the recordings were made. While there are many excellent professional near-field monitors in the marketplace today, there is no industry guideline or standards to ensure that they are used. The lack of meaningful or perceptually relevant loudspeaker specifications makes the excellent loudspeakers difficult to identify and separate from the truly mediocre ones. To make matters worse, some misguided recording engineers monitor and tweak their recordings through low-fidelity loudspeakers, thinking that this represents what the average consumer will hear. Well, we're not the average consumer, obviously, because we have some high-end systems, right? Since loudspeakers can be mediocre in an infinite let me get this thing out of the way, infinite number of ways, this practice only guarantees that the quality of the recording will be compromised when heard through good loudspeakers. This is a very counterproductive if we want to improve the quality and consistency of audio recording and reproduction. That makes sense, right? Okay. So now this Yamaha NS10 was a very, very popular speaker that was used in recording studios. And so there was an article out, and I copied the article from Wikipedia. And it says, love or hate the Yamaha NS10, this is unassuming little speaker has found a place in the studios of many of the world's top producers. We trace in history and investigate why a monitor whose sound has been described as horrible became an industry standard. It has a 5 dB boost in the mid-range at around 2K, and the bottom starts rolling off at 200. So that's kind of not what we would call high fidelity. Recording studios around the world, particularly those specializing in rock and pop music, adopted the speaker as a standard. In excess of 200,000 pairs were sold throughout the world. So how many recordings did they produce? Who knows? Millions, because there's 200,000 pairs. Gizmodo referred to it as the most important loudspeaker you never heard of. And there it is, the famous Yamaha NS10. If you look at that frequency response, it's just not really good. You see the boost of 5 dB at a very, very high frequency that your ears are really sensitive. So these definitely would be aggressive sounding speakers. So can you imagine the engineer trying to mix with these? They've got to stop the aggression. So they're going to lower the they're going to take the mixing board and EQ the heck out of this, because there's no way this could sound good. But now after it's EQ'd to this speaker, now it's transferred to your system. Oops, let me go back. Okay, so this is funny. Bob Claremont's other significant claim to fame is probably that he was the first to use tissue paper over the NSN tweeter in an attempt to dull their overall brightness. Examining the Yamaha NS10 tissue paper phenomena, analysis of the industry-wide practice of using tissue paper. Now, Bart did this with Charlie speakers one time when they got silver wired. So Bart has tried this tissue paper phenomena. But that's what they used to do. It was so bright, they'd put tissue paper. And if you look at the response on the right, that's the original. And it was actually a lot better with the tissue paper. That just cracks me up. So there was all these techniques to try to make this speaker sound better. Joe, I'll get you, Joe. Let me just go ahead and finish this.
All right. You did say to delay my question till later. I'll do that.
Okay. Now we go into the loudness words with bobcats. I actually had bobcats at my house one time where I used to live in Covington Place. He came to my house and listened to my system. It was pretty interesting. But the audible consequence has been that volume of pop, rock, and other music recorded and released on commercial CDs has risen steadily since the 1980s, with a corresponding reduction in dynamics and in many cases a trend towards more aggressive and fatiguing sound character. So the loudness wars over a period of time, especially in 1980 through 2000s, the music just got louder, all in an attempt to make each track as louder as perceived competition. It's bewildering to think that the audio format that offered the greatest dynamic range potentially ever made available to the consumer is now routinely used to store music. I got to go in the other room because my dog's barking. Store music deliberately. To store music deliberately processed with the least possible dynamic range in the history of recorded music. So, okay, and this is an interesting thing. If you look on the left, that's ZZ Top Sharp Dressed Man, recorded in 2000, 2008, and 1983. 1983 had the most dynamic range. Sharp Dressed Man in 2000 was absolutely pegged the meters and it was put into distortion. So a lot of people think that just because it's a reprocessed recording that it's better, but many times the first recordings were better than the redubbed recordings. So Francis Rumsey, Spatial Audio, this is the book that I would highly recommend. It's very interesting. Only 5% of the recordings that are sold on the commercial market are actually recordings where there was any sort of natural environment reproduced. Very few recordings that we listen to on a day-to-day basis are actually recordings of natural spaces that are attempting to give you a concert hall-like experience. In the home, essentially, classical music is where you try to recreate some semblance of natural acoustic space in the reproduction environment. And even more, most classical recording engineers would admit that they don't actually attempt to reproduce natural acoustics in the listening room because mostly that is not what people want. The commercial classical music recording sound often involves quite a lot of close microphones, artificial reverb. In other words, these microphones are right over the instrument. They're not recording the hall. The reverb is added later, so you're not hearing the hall reverb in many, many cases. The recordings are essentially manufactured for a commercial audience to succeed on a relatively small number of channels, and this is even true of five-channel recordings. Okay, so I think this is almost my last slide, so if you can bear with me a little bit. The closest you will ever get, now this is very interesting. The closest you will ever get to the sound of the instrument, I'm trying to close this window, here we go. The instrument or a voice actually recorded is what the producer and engineer hear at the recording console through the monitor speakers that they are listening to. It is technically impossible to get any closer, with the very rare exception being direct to disc recordings. This means that 99.99% of all recorded music goes through the following process. First, an engineer has to find a microphone with all its inherent character and limitations to put in front of the instrument amplifier vocalist. Then the sound runs through some pretty crappy, very, very long cables in the control room. And I've seen these long cables. They're not kidding. We're talking 26 gauge wire in some cases. Then it passes through a mixing console with all sort of crappy wire and dozens of faders and tone controls, equalizers, limiters, and compressors. Then the sound passes through an amplifier and then to mostly, but not always, cheap lamp cord speaker wire from a hardware store, which is connected to some of the worst sounding speakers. These speakers are considered excruciating revealing for the purpose of deep analysis. Then the producer finally hears the sound and decides what combination of tones, after a lot of tweaks and processing, sounds the most authentic to them. Once the recording portion is finished, the tape or hard drive is mixed through yet another set of gear manned by more engineers and a mixer specialist. Yet another set of people that think that they think what they engineer is what you should hear, who then make more decisions using another set of limiters, compressors, equalizers. After all that, the mixed finished tape or hard drive is sent to a mastering lab where another bunch of people with yet another set of compressors, limiters, and EQs have decided if the music sounds uniform in both volume and tone. Then for vinyl, the RAA curve has to be added to make sure that the bass is cut down as the recording nears the end groove so the needle doesn't jump out of the groove. Get it? Many people make decisions about what they think sounds correct. The fact that some recordings sound amazing is a happy confluence of circumstance, giving all the ways that the final recording could get screwed up due to all these factors I just mentioned. So if that didn't depress you, we still love music, okay? And we're gonna listen to music and we're gonna still try to find the best recordings. But I just wanted to let you know about these people that say, oh my gosh, I got to romance the recording. I want to listen to what the engineer thought. I want to listen to this. It's not really what it is. Anyways, here we go, on guard. So I'll pass it to whoever, actually anyone that has any questions or comments on what we just talked about. I tried to speed through it, but I
Thank
think
you,
Joe had his
John. That was,
hand raised.
yeah, that was a great overview of what we're really dealing with and trying to reproduce what sounds like live, real music. We'll go in the order of raised hands here, and Joe, and then Mike, and then Gary. Joe, you have the floor.
I just found the tissue paper analogy pretty amazing. Especially you talked about trying it on Charlie's speakers, and I thought that he has horn speakers. So that's
Yes.
that's a pretty big piece of tissue paper you needed
Yeah.
to cover the
Yeah,
whole
you can,
horn,
yeah,
right?
you have to ask Bart exactly what he used, but I know that there was a certain point where I guess they used some silver wire and they got really aggressive.
They got
Bart will tell you the story, Joe. If you're ever at the
okay.
audio meeting, just pull them aside. It is absolutely hilarious what they did. Bart will tell you the story.
So with all our graphs and measuring and all our analysis of all that, somebody took a piece of tissue paper and decided that toned down the NS10.
And
So
they made it. And if you saw the second measurement, it was better.
okay.
Did they compare Kleenex versus another brand, or maybe it was
I
Charmin
don't.
toilet paper they used?
Maybe the
I don't
brand
know
with
if they
the
did
cream
that.
built in, with the skin cream built in was better.
Well, if they used toilet paper, maybe it sounded less shitty.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, Joe, interesting.
Uh,
Mike?
So when I was a younger man, I was in a band, and we recorded. We put out 3 records, so we had 3 records that we put. We recorded each one of these records in a different studio. So what John was saying about the studio conditions is absolutely correct. It's never the same from one to the other We started out in a studio that was in a gas station, and the garage bay was the drum room. Got a really great drum sound in that room. You did the vocals in one of the offices. You did the next one we did in somebody's house. So somebody had set up their house where they had a console in one of the rooms. I did the vocals in a bedroom. The drummer was isolated. The last one we did at Morrisound, we did a couple of them at Morrisound actually, which was their very famous local studio for death metal. And they've just been commended and given a plaque and all the other stuff. So they was a night and day difference there. Was that, we were dealing with a 36 track machine. So it was way different. We didn't even have to be at the place at the same time to do any of the music, which, by the way, the music loses a lot when the musicians are not there at the same time. But in each instance, the mix down was done with one guy sitting in front of the mixing board, or maybe some band members behind him giving him some feedback that he didn't want, and 2 monitors. And they were always towed in, and they were either up a little bit, or they were right on the edges of the console. So they were all working with two speakers that were directional speakers that focused right on the engineer's head. All of the effects and stuff that we're talking about, very little of it is done at the guitar. It's almost all done at the mixing board, especially the bass. The bass is direct line almost all the time, plugged right into the mixing board. Anything they're doing to that bass is usually done at the mixer. All the panning, all the other stuff. The guitar players will use their rack of gizmos, is what we used to call them, and they'll get all kinds of effects and everything, but the mic is hung over top of the amp, dangling in front of the speaker on the amp. And they pick which microphones they want. The drum room has a couple of live mics, and then they have some of the other stuff that's direct mic. That all gets mixed in. All of that stuff gets mixed in. So there's never a natural sound to anything. If the engineers wants it to be natural sounding, then you probably should listen to a Maple Shade recording, because all they do with those is put a couple of mics in a room and everybody plays. You can tell the difference between a Maple Shade recording and every other recording you hear, especially if you're working with real studio work. So
I heard David Chesky does a little of that too. Chesky recording.
Some of that stuff. But the thing is, when you listen to those, you hear the room. You hear a lot of the room. When you're listening to a studio recording from somebody else, any of the room that you're hearing is probably added in after the fact. So that's my personal experience with and it's a real world experience because I did experience all of it. So that what John was saying was true about it's never the same. Even when you go into the studio and you do 2 songs and you're doing a 4-song disc and you come back a week later to do the other 2 songs in the same studio, it ain't the same again. You know, it's just, and you can listen to our records and you can hear the inconsistencies and what's going on. So it's never the same.
Before I get to Gary, let me interject something. A couple other labels to consider that do live, either in studio or live recordings, like with 1 or 2 mics, basically without much processing. And that it would be Blue Coast Records, also Sound Liaison, which is a Netherlands-based label, and also MA Records, Todd Garfinkel, who went out with just a digital recorder with a stereo mic and recorded in churches in Europe. And in those types of recordings, you can really hear the venue, hear the room, hear the reverb. That's all natural, basically unprocessed or minimally processed. There's probably some post-production mastering, but not a lot. And I think I've seen some videos. I think Cookie Marenko has done this, and also Sound Liaison, where they position the musicians, like if in a jazz quartet, around the mic and move their position until they get the right balance, and just use the natural position of the musicians to get the right balance rather than processing it afterwards. So there are labels that exist that do that.
A lot of guitar work is done in a tiled bathroom, by the way. Listen to the recordings. The guitarist will be in his amp will be in a tiled bathroom, and they get some great reverb and some great echo going on in there. There's all kinds of tricks they use. They use all kinds of tricks.
Yeah, but those are primarily studio recordings, or you may even be laying down tracks in different cities and then assembling it afterwards.
That's correct. And also the guitarist will lay down a track in the bathroom, and then he'll go and lay down a track in the studio, and they'll mix the 2 together to get the final track that you're listening to. So Amazing. They can never reproduce that live. So the idea that you're going to get a live sound out of that can't be reproduced live. When we went into the studio to do the things, making something that sounded like a live performance, farthest thing from our mind. We had all these toys to play with, that we couldn't do anything live. We couldn't do it live. We wanted to play with the stuff, and we wanted to make the stuff sound unlike live. So to me, whenever we say we want this to sound like live music, I think that you were chasing the wrong dragon there. But
one thing we can do, hopefully, if we can bring in a musician or a group of musicians to perform for us and record them like we did in the past with the piano cello concert we had, and record it analog and digital, and then immediately play it back. That's another interesting way we heard it live and then immediately hear it played back on the host system or whatever we cobbled together. That'd be an interesting experiment.
You hear the room twice. You hear the room twice then.
Well, Mike,
if you're playing it back in the same room it was recorded in. When we did that last time, we went downstairs. It was what's his name? That Asian guy. I forget his name, who did it. And he had a phenomenal listening room downstairs. He had quad speakers. AJ, what was his name? I forget. Anyways,
you're talking about the gentleman over in Palm Harbor.
Well, he was in St. Pete, I think, but
it was Palm Harbor.
Lung was his first name.
Yes, Al Lung.
Al Lung, yeah.
I fear he has passed, because I've tried for a while
to
contact him. And
yeah.
By the way, Mike, what you just said about recordings and reflections, did you say that if you play it back and get the reflections in your room, that's incorrect?
No, what I'm saying is, what we were just talking about is if you record it in your room, right? And then you play it back in your room, you get the reflections twice. You're getting it once on the recording and once when it's getting played back. So I'm not sure what you're accomplishing by doing that. So that's why when you record something in a studio, the reverb is on the guitar. They don't try to put a room sound in the thing, because you're going to be playing it back in a room. So there's no, at least with us, there was no room sound. We didn't try to make it sound like we were doing anything live. I'm sure there's all kinds of, there's a million ways to skin a cat. I'm just telling you how we skinned our cat.
I played in a band too for many years. And if you want to go, I don't know how far back you want to go with this, but if you really go far back and look at a Fender guitar or a Les Paul guitar, they're solid body guitars. So once if you're talking about a band with a guitar and a bass, Fender came out with a solid body bass, the Fender Precision bass, and really took out uh, all the overtones of any double bass, and they took away all the overtones of all guitars ever made. I mean, we went to a semi-hollow body guitar to a solid body guitar, and basically all you got is strings resonating against the pickup. So all depending on how far back you want to go, especially with rock, those instruments don't even have any natural acoustical properties to them at all. They don't resonate at all. They don't have any ambience to them at all. So, I guess you could take this as far back, to the pickup or the microphone, or even before that, and then say somebody's trying to get an actual recording in their room. So that's a long trip.
All right, interesting points. Okay, Gary, and then Grant.
Okay, well, as you know, I do recording, and in a simple way, I have tried to have a meeting where I invite them to come along to my recording session, and then after I get home and get it all edited and everything, to have another meeting and have them listen to the replay. That hasn't worked out very well, except for Dan Field came and did it. My message is basically each recording is a new work of art. It doesn't necessarily sound like any location where the performance happened. It may be based on that, and they may have some very good engineers there and mics and everything, and they may try for that effect. But usually, no, I don't use any monitors when I'm recording something. I just try to imagine what's the best spot to put my stereo pair, and I record, and I don't expect it to sound like the best seat in the house where I put those microphones. They're usually a little closer to the group than I am when I'm there, or when a person is there in attendance at the best seat. And you take care of most of this on playback, and it's a little too complicated to get into here, but I'm going to touch on the answer to this question in my presentation, and that's it for now.
All righty, interesting thoughts, Gary. Grant?
So I don't do any professional audio recording or anything, but I have a reasonably decent microphone literally sitting in front of me. It's what you all are listening to. And the difference of literally a foot is a huge difference versus here. My voice did not change. My tone did not change. That is just getting closer to the microphone. Microphone placement is going to matter so much more when it comes to any reproduction. Sure, the actual instruments that are being played, wonderful, right? Those can matter. But if the microphone is back here versus right here, that's a big difference for the way that it sounds. And I think that's going to absolutely attribute more than anything else here, in my opinion.
Great demonstration. That's very true.
Hey, Alan.
Yes.
Alan.
Yes, I hear you, Russ. We hear you, Russ.
Yeah, real quickly, can I interject? Because I can't stay on. I'm up in the side of a mountain up in North Carolina. So
All right.
I just want to say, yeah, I don't agree that you're trying to recreate a sound environment or a live sound environment. You can make it sound live in your room, but that's about the extent of it. If you would like to read the essay that I wrote a number of years ago, it's on our discussion page 17, under is it live or is it ? And I wrote that a number of years ago, and I explained my experience with what sounds live in my room. But my final answer is that, yeah, you really can't expect to build a system to make what every recording sound like it's live. You just can't do that. But anyway, I've got to hop off because I'm traveling and we're with family right now on this. Like I said, I'll show you in the background here. Hold on a second. Let me get up. Oh yeah, there's my background.
Here, I'll pin. Oh,
Yeah, you're gonna make us jealous, Russ.
wait,
So
I'll
anyway,
share it. I'm
yeah,
gonna
so
make it
anyway-
real big so everybody can see. Here,
Oh,
do it again.
Okay, there you go. So that's where I am right now. So it's I go this way. So anyway, yeah, so I got to sign off. I just wanted to tell people, go to page 17 under general discussion on our meetup group, and you'll read, is it live or is it a question mark? And you can read it for yourself. So anyway, I'm glad I was able to hop on quickly, but I'm going to go ahead and hop off and say bye to everybody.
See
Okay,
you later,
stay in
Ross.
touch before you move.
All right, thanks. See you. Bye.
All righty. AJ, your thoughts.
Right. So I just wanted to kind of point out that there should be a separation between what
Yeah.
we're talking about, between electronic type recordings, studio type recordings, and acoustic instrument recordings, where you very well should be able to recognize an acoustic instrument like a violin or a guitar or something of that nature, as having a particular type of sound. And when you get to electronic music, it could be purely electronically generated from a computer. You have no idea what that actually is supposed to sound like. And the recordings that Mike was talking about with his band, where it's again a live guitar through a guitar amplifier, that sort of thing. Other than the drums, you may not be able to recognize much of anything as saying, well, that should sound like this, because there's so many variations of how you turn up the distortion on a Fender amp with a guitar, blah blah blah. And if you saw it quote unquote live, if there was a live performance being attended, it might actually be monophonic with a stack of PA speakers. So do you really want to recreate that? I mean, that's not really something most people are going to try to recreate with a stereo system. However, if you're talking about a jazz or classical or some other type of acoustic reference, and this goes back to the essay that G. Gordon Holt wrote in Stereophile, lamenting the fact that audiophiles way back when, because did he die in like the 90s? I think it was, but he was talking about in the 80s. There was a article in Stereophile written by John Atkinson talking to G. Gordon Holt, who had started Stereophile, and asking about what he thought about modern day trends in audio. And he was laughing. He said, "Look, we lost the acoustic instrument standard a long time ago, and audiophiles became people who just wanted something that sounded good to them." Well, that's called preference. There is no standard when it comes to that, because whatever you prefer is what you prefer. And so if you preferred your system to sound like something playing rock music or electronic music, then that's great, but there really can't be a standard for that you would say, boy, that really sounds like such and such. Because going back to what I just said, if you heard that live, it's a stack of PA systems in mono, or PA speakers in mono. However, if you've been to concert halls, if you've heard a live acoustic jazz quartet or something like that, then playing it back in a stereo system is near hopeless for a real recreation, because you've reduced it down to 2 channels, which is impossible to recreate the full spatial aspect of a real event room, etc. But you can get semblances of, hey, that sounds like a hi-hat, that sounds like a drum kit, that sounds like a stand-up acoustic bass. You can hear the strings being plucked. So maybe there are folks like myself who want to hear semblances of what that would sound like live. That's what realism is to me, is that you're playing back a recording, it's a recording, but you hear semblances of what you would hear live if you attended an event where that band, for example, was playing.
Interesting. Moving along that same concept, there's an album I have. There was a group, I went to a Renaissance fair many years ago. This probably goes back 15 years ago in the old TBLS days. And Harley Day, who you all may remember, who's a phenomenal speaker builder and raconteur. He's not active with us anymore, but he had told us about this performance by this Renaissance group called Cantiga. It was comprised of primarily music teachers at the university level, and they played a lot of unique instruments. And they performed in St. Pete in an outdoor venue, and I attended that. And they were selling the CD, not of that particular recording, but of that album that they had performed that had been recorded in the exact positioning of the musicians. And I, after having just heard that live performance, I went home, played the CD, and the recording was almost to a T, the exact presentation, image, sound stage, tonality, everything. And I often use that recording in particular with my failing or fading auditory memory to test my system to see if it really is reproducing what I heard. I don't know how many of you have had an opportunity to hear something like that, where the recording, maybe even present at a recording and then got to take the recording home. Like Gary obviously has done that. Have any others had that opportunity where they've heard something live and a recording of it that pretty much reproduced what they heard? Lenny, your hand is up. Orchestral performances, certainly.
What was your recording, Alan?
It was called Martha's Dragon by Cantiga, Cantiga. I don't know if that CD is available, for purchase anywhere. And it was a Renaissance group playing very unique instruments. It's just interesting that I always use that, not always, but I often use it as a reference point. So, Mike, your hand is up again, and then Tony.
Yeah, so
And then we'll go on to get Gary's presentation here in a little bit.
I want to just speak a little bit to what AJ said about the drum sound. If you listen to rock music or any type of, every album's got a different drum sound. So, and that's all done with the microphones and the mixing board and everything else. Led Zeppelin, for instance, has a very specific drum sound that you could tell their music if you didn't know who it was based on the drums. So each engineer will have a way, or each producer will have a way to mic the drums, to work with the drums, so that every one of each set has they have their own version of realism, I guess you might call it. Because the drums themselves are not going to have that much of a variable as the recordings do. And I want to bring up something that John had showed in his thing, the ZZ Top album, not that particular album, he said, but let's say, for instance, Tres Hombres was remastered by Steve Hoffman. And the drums on that album, when they remastered it, were completely replaced. If you listen to the very first pressing of that, the drums are weak and there's not much meat to them. You listen to the remastered version and they replaced those drums. And they did that so that it would fit in more with the ZZ Top's Greatest Hits album that was being released, that had all recordings that were much newer than Tres Hombres was. So it is possible to go, and I took one of our records into the studio, one of our tapes into the studio, and digitized it, and I performed magic tricks with it. For instance, I made sure my voice was in proper pitch. So that was a big trick, by the way. And then there was the timing of some drums that were in there. They were readjusted. The engineer would cut a piece out and say, "You're right on the money here, so we're going to just paste that in." Pro Tools is a wonderful, wonderful thing that can correct all kinds of issues in the studio. So when you're hearing something that's recorded in a studio, it likely is not anything like what the musicians laid down.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, thank you, Mike. Tony, and then we'll get on with Gary's presentation to follow.
So with respect to what was brought up just a few moments ago, so before I moved down to Florida, I was a patron of the Philadelphia Symphony Orchestra in Philadelphia, and I spent 30 years listening to that orchestra, and I was at many weekend events where, over the course of that weekend, recordings were made for release. The best releases were from the last sequence they did with the Ondine label, which was a very good label. Everything was recorded and minimally processed. But to the points made earlier, I mean, I would count the number of microphones that were being used for a full orchestra. And sometimes it would get up to 19 or 21 microphones.
Wow.
Sometimes it was done actually unusually. Sometimes it would only be down to like 6 or 8 of them. But the point is, it can never sound like that in a house. First of all, the venue is not large enough unless you've got Mike's room. I don't think there's any venue large enough to even remotely approach the kind of space that is true in a symphony hall. But to AJ's point, if the recording is done well enough and in your own home, you can say, I think I recognize, that violin. I think I recognize that I think I can actually tell the difference between a violin, a viola, and the upper registers of a cello. I think I where I hear that cello coming from, I think I know that. I mean, if you're somebody like me who's been there for 30 years, if you can pick those out and get a semblance of what you heard live. And oh, by the way, a lot of times those recordings were pieced together over 2 or 3 days worth of performances.
Mm-hmm.
So what you hear is not necessarily what is actually on the recording. It could be over the course of 2 or 3 days where they'll take different movements and piece them together. But I guess really I'm making this longer than it should be, but I'm sort of agreeing with AJ that at least for acoustic captures, if they're well processed, reasonably well processed, if you can get a semblance of recognition, then I'll say you're doing pretty darn well.
Did the Philadelphia sound as good as your stereo system, Tony?
Well, so we heard when you were here, I played you the Kansas City Saint-Saëns, but I also have I was at the Philadelphia performance of the Organ Symphony, the one that they recorded and put out. I was at that performance. And when I play it here, it sounds good, but boy, it doesn't sound the way it did live. But there are things in the recording that capture my recollection of the semblance of what I heard when I was there. And again, to AJ's point, if we can get that far, I'll say we're doing pretty darn well.
Yeah, a good thing to watch if you want to see what the difficulties of recording are is when the BAS presented a program that had the people that record the Boston Symphony, and they told all about how they position mics and do all this processing and everything about it. And if you think about it for a few seconds, some of the instruments are like 30 to 50 feet away from the front microphones. And the reason that you need so many microphones is that you wouldn't be able to hear the harp or the piccolo or whatever
Exactly.
that's complaining about your recording is complaining about if you didn't have all those mics. And then by the time you have all that many mics, you got to do time delay for the front mics, or else the rear mics will be 30 or 50 milliseconds behind the front, and so on and so on. And it becomes an impossible problem until you realize that they just have to work on it until it becomes a new work of art.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, AJ, and then Lenny. I see Lenny's hand up. AJ, your rebuttal, and then Lenny.
Not a rebuttal. I was just talking about like what Tony was talking about, attending live at a symphony and something like that. There's absolutely no way a stereo is going to reproduce that. First of all, you have to have more than 2 channels to reproduce that. And along those lines, I actually rejoined Tidal because I dropped them when they adopted that MQA scam thing. I said, there's no way I'm going to put a penny of mine towards that scam that Bob Stewart came up with. They finally, that is dead as a doornail as far as I know. So I rejoined Tidal because they are going to be doing things with Atmos recordings where it'll be multi-channel. They already have some, I think, probably not a huge catalog, but I'm going to start exploring the Tidal catalog for multi-channel Atmos type recordings, especially for classical. I don't know why anyone would want to listen to a rock recording that would have been in mono if you heard it live in a 7-channel system. But for classical music, jazz, that sort of thing, it makes perfect sense to me because that's what you hear in a live venue is sound coming from all around you, etc. And to finish up, there's a new a company that's supposedly going to come out with multi-channel in Auro 3D. I don't know if you've heard of that one. That's one of the newer surround formats. I'm tracking that one to see if and when they come out with stuff. But for classical music aficionados like myself, that'll be a godsend because 99.9% of streaming services of what you hear, CDs, whatever, are 2-channel, obviously, which is great for just, rock, that sort of thing. But for acoustic, especially classical, you definitely need more than 2 channels.
Have you got surround in your lab now, AJ?
I beg your pardon?
Have you got surround sound in your lab?
My lab? You mean in my house? I've always had surround sound in my house, but I don't have a specific Dolby Atmos set up yet. I have a Denon receiver that'll do it, and the main driver or impetus, I should say, for getting that done is that is like I said, Tidal is streaming in Atmos. Amazon, they purportedly have these Atmos things, but you have to use their silly little smart speakers or some nonsense like that. I think the Tidal one you can stream it through a multi-channel system, a receiver. But I'm working on getting that set up, and then like I said, I'll post on Meetup the new company that I've heard about that should be. I think they're going to be mainly almost all classical multi-channel in Auro 3D.
Interesting. Thank you. Okay, Lenny, and then Gary will do your presentation.
Years ago, the Boston Audio Society, we used to regularly record Benjamin Zander and all his concerts in different venues. So we had the opportunity to record Marvelous Resurrection Symphony, which is one of the largest pieces of music there is in Symphony Hall. And it was an interesting thing because we had multiple, and I mean multiple mic setups. The setup that my friend who engineered it his idea was simply this: I want to get the sound of Symphony Hall. We used a pair of AKG 414 coincident mics, 2 mics, 15 rows back. Ran a string across, 15 rows back. All the rest of the folks in the club did the same thing with multiple mic setups. Plus, we also used the radio station setup, which was too many damn mics. I hate multiple mics with a passion. Anyhow, after this was over, we set up a pretty good system in a pretty good room, and we had the conductor there, and we just had a shootout with all of these different mic techniques. The one that people liked the best, there were 2. One fellow named Ken Dean did it with minimal mics and a little closer up than we did, and most people liked ours. The reason was because it sounded like the orchestra in Symphony Hall. Yes, yeah. In this particular performance, the the conductor followed Mahler's intentions, which nobody ever does in a recording, and he left the soloist back in the choir. So was it hard to hear them? Yeah, it was a little, but that's how it sounded. It was fantastic. I have a direct copy of that tape, and I'll be happy to play it with anybody. It never leaves my side. That's it.
By the way, everybody know the finale this year with the Florida Orchestra coming
Yeah.
up this weekend is Mahler's Resurrection Symphony, which I had tickets to, but it turns out we're leaving Saturday morning. I assumed that I could exchange it for the tickets at Strauss, and they're not performing it at Strauss. It's only at Mahaffey on Saturday and then Ruth Eckerd on Sunday. So I'm going to the rehearsal, which is Thursday. The open rehearsal and talk with Michael Francis is Thursday evening at Mahaffey.
Yeah,
Highly
he's not
recommend
playing
it.
the whole thing, unfortunately.
No, portions of. Alrighty, let's hold our questions until Gary does his presentation, which is a different perspective. We've heard about the recording and how much impact that has. Now we're going to hear more about the room and the speaker setup and the impact it has.
Okay, let's see if I can get to it. Slideshow from the beginning. Okay, can you see that?
Yep. You're
All
good.
right. I'm going to start out with my latest rant, and then I want to talk about an answer to the narrative question, which was how should our stereo systems, what should they sound like? And then I'll try to go through a simple explanation of how I recommend to do it, and see how it goes. Then you can jump on me. You remember my editorial and this drawing of the image model of sound in rooms. The image model, I'll use this drawing to just illustrate the parts of the model. Get my pointer here. Obviously, the room is these lines, 20 feet wide, around 35 feet long. The speakers are positioned 5 feet over and 5 feet out from the walls. These are called the corner secondary reflections. These are the infamous first sidewall reflections. And what you're listening to in any system is the 2 actual speakers plus 6 reflections of those speakers, whether you know it or not, depending, of course, on where you place your speakers and what their radiation pattern is. The reason I'm ranting about this is because the YouTubers and most writers don't seem to understand about the spatial nature of the sound in rooms. They talk about frequency response, directivity. This, for example, is from Audioholics, I believe it, and they talk about wide dispersion versus narrow dispersion. Where is the sweet spot and how wide is it? And all this stuff, without ever considering that the radiation pattern might have a rearward component. This is Earl Getty's drawings of perfect directivity. They talk about the various constant directivity and dispersion patterns and which ones are good, better, and best. This one is supposed to be absolutely impossible, impossibly wide, but of course any Omni can achieve that. This one is supposed to be the perfect one that is not usually achieved. All this stuff that has nothing to do with the total directivity of the speaker, which in my view should be front and rear. What should our system sound like? Here's what I did. As I said, I invited the club to come and watch me record a symphonic piece. They're amateur musicians, but it's a full symphony in a church. It's not a concert hall, but it's big enough to be similar to a concert hall. and I decided to take out a listening form, close my eyes and listen to the music as if I was listening to my stereo system. What did I hear? What am I listening for, and what can I distinguish in the sound in front of me? The biggest impression that I had was the spaciousness or the openness of the sound, which all audiophiles seem to also appreciate. For example, when the cymbals clashed, you could hear that they were on the left side or the right side, but you didn't pinpoint anything in particular. You just heard that it was big. This applies especially to the bass, because maybe one of the reasons that the engineers will boost the bass response in a recording is because the bass in a live environment just sounds so big, because it reverberates all around the place. So to reproduce an impression of bass like that, you simply turn it up on playback and do the best you can, right? So spaciousness, bigness, deepness. Once upon a time, if you are old enough along with me to remember when the 901s came out, the impression, it made quite an impression on everybody, mainly when they came into a room with those playing. They said, holy mackerel, it sounds so big. It sounds like the instruments are right in the room with you. And where's all that sound coming from? Those little boxes? They couldn't believe it. And this is why. The model. The model is not right or wrong. It's not correctable or not correct. It's just an MRI of the sound in your room. You simply draw the actual speakers and their 6 reflections, and it's just as if you were listening to a lattice of 8 speakers in front of you rather than just 2, because of their reflection patterns. You can use this model to analyze a lot of aspects of how to do stereo. Speaker positioning is the main one. The model can show you things like what leads to a hole in the middle. If you place your speakers too wide apart, thinking that you're going to get a wider sound stage, and they have any kind of wide dispersion, you're going to get this effect. If you place them too far into the corners, like a Klipschorn or something, you're going to get this effect, clustering of the sound near the corners, near the front and the side walls, that will kind of destroy your center image focus. The correct position, according to Gary, is a quarter of the width of the room in from the side walls and the same amount out from the front wall. This gives a perfectly even matrix of direct and reflected sources for even imaging all the way across. At the same time, the direct to reflected ratio, which not many have considered in the YouTuber universe, works like this. If you have direct sound only, you get a sound similar to this, as most of us know. But if you have some rear output, you get a pattern that looks like this. You get more wide, spacious output and deeper image in your room, because of a harmless image shift toward the reflecting surfaces that tends to suspend the images in space. You imagine your direct firing speaker, take a bookshelf speaker in your hand and aim it at your face, then turn it around and aim it at your front wall. The sound will recede toward the wall and seem deeper in your room. Do the same thing toward the side walls, and you'll see that it goes wider. So if you do all of those things at once, you get an impression of the imaging somewhere behind the plane of the actual speakers, and hopefully from wall to wall, not just speaker to speaker. Radiation pattern. Let's use this model to study how radiation patterns should be done to achieve a more perfect image. If you've heard of the Mark Davis design for the DBX Sound Field 1, you'll remember that he had two lobes. He had the main lobe of the direction going toward the opposite speaker. Can you see that in there? And what that did was time intensity trading, because as you went off to one side, the speaker on the opposite side, you got into its direct path more, and you got nearer to the speaker on your side, and it kept the central image centered. So my ideal radiation pattern for the ultimate Gary speaker would look something like this. I want the front half of the radiation pattern to have Davis's lobes going toward the opposite speaker for time intensity trading. And I want the rear half to have greater output, first of all, and a lobe going toward the same corner of the room that it is on, in order to light up the rear four reflections and deepen the sound image. But it's difficult to achieve that pattern precisely, and that pattern may not be perfect for every room that you want to put these speakers in. So the answer is to have a speaker with variable directivity. And to reflect the function of such a loudspeaker, you change the name from ordinary loudspeaker to image model projector. If you were to have a speaker with like 30-degree faces on it, both front and rear, and a gain control on each face, you could shape the radiation pattern to the room for whatever room it was put in order to create that radiation pattern that would adjust the width and the depth of your ultimate sound image to your taste. It might look something like that. That's a styrofoam model that I put some fake speakers and chrome pieces and plastic pieces on, and some lettering to show what it might look like if somebody would just build it for me. We have to also address acoustics, as I talked about in the article also. I agree with the first sidewall reflection needing to be diminished in order to stop the collapsing of the soundstage to the same side that you're on. If you wander over to the right side and you didn't diminish this reflection, the whole soundstage would tend to collapse over to the right. But if you have the Davis radiation pattern and you diminish this, or both, then the center image will stay centered. Corner traps are interesting as well. We want to keep the corner secondary reflection as loud as possible, but I found out by experimentation that sound tends to collect in the corners and cause frequency response problems. But if you just put a trap there, you have even tonality all the way across the soundstage. Let's look at the model and see what that shows about absorption of that first sidewall reflection. This is the full model, and if you have some absorption on the sidewalls to diminish those first sidewall reflections, then you're left with the direct sound here and the early reflected images back there. Diffusion is helpful too, because it can help to erase the perception of the size and shape of the actual room that you're in. And you might put some at the front wall, and you might put some diffusion here where the corner secondary reflections come to you to broaden them. And here, of course, it might help to also broaden and diminish that first sidewall reflection. Notice how the 30-degree face on the direct sound on the actual speakers directs the sound to the person on the opposite side of that speaker for time intensity trading. In the model, I'd like to show how that looks. That's without any absorption or diffusion, but with some diffusion, it kind of erases the shape and size of your actual room, which is helpful. Dipoles and the latest Rage open baffle, very interesting. If you had a typical dipole like a quad ESL 63, or maybe even your Martin Logans or Spatial Audio M4s, or the latest Rage is some IO naked NR. Anybody heard of that? Anyway, it's a open baffle, and if you take a dipole of any description, practically, put it as I've suggested, turn it 30 degrees inward, towed in, it will have all those characteristics that I've described that are desirable for spaciousness and depth and width and the direct sound part of the image and everything that seems to be good. And audiophiles seem to agree with that. Then what else do you have to do? You know, it's not enough just to set up your speakers correctly and do your radiation pattern and set all those gains on all the faces and do everything perfectly. Your room could still have too much liveness. So what you want to do is suck down the reverb time to less than a half a second from everything I've read and done here. And you do that with normal furnishings plus carpeting, maybe some absorbers here and there. Anthony Gramani has his recommendations on how to do absorption and diffusion, which I basically would agree with, I guess. How do you EQ it? You want to do it at the listening position to be able to EQ the total power response in your room. This is mine. A little bit of bass lift because of what I said about bass not seeming as big in your small listening room as it is in a live recording. Plus, we like a lot of bass, right? And as AJ said, another secret is surround sound. And using those extra speakers, a surround sound receiver can take care of most everything that has to do with the sound in your room. You can adjust the distance of every speaker, and then it sets electronic delays so that when the sounds need to pan around your room, every speaker is actually electrically the same distance from you. So the panning works very smoothly. And I only have 2 side speakers as my surround sound. And just because I've set the distance with my receiver and I've set the gains of all the speakers to be the same, no speakers dominate others. It can also set EQ because most of them come with a measurement microphone. I do my own EQ in the listening position. And of course, the playback modes are very important. All the recordings are not made with the same surround system. So you got to know whether it's Atmos or Neuro or Dolby surround or whatever mode it has been recorded in. It's supposed to be played back in. For my own surround sound recordings, I can't hear the channelization correctly unless I have it in multi-channel. is the mode that it's called. No other surround sound mode works. This is my story, and I'm sticking to it. When I play back ordinary stereo recordings, I get, because of the direct and reflected sound and the way that I deploy my speakers and adjust everything, I get a sound image that floats in a plane behind the plane of the speakers from wall to wall with a lot of depth, spaciousness, and good bass response. I have two subwoofers, one here and one over here, you can't see. But if I put it in surround sound and adjust everything perfectly, it can go beyond the front corners of the room. That's not a mistake. And in fact, some of my recordings are done in the mid-side MS mode, and they can image all the way over to the side, all around me, if they've been recorded that way. So you can hear the audience applause where it belongs instead of behind the orchestra, like in stereo. I don't know what else I can say, but thank you for listening.
Thank you, Gary. That was a great presentation and great visuals.
How do I
We
get
can
out
open
of
it up
here?
for discussion. Yeah, if you just, there we
Okay.
go. And I'll just call on people in the order of the raised hands. And Bart, your hand has been up for a while. Go ahead.
All right. Gary, thank you very much. And John, thank you very much. Two great talks. There are two comments I have from when I was pretty involved with room acoustics. One of the rules for speaker positioning that I read from several different people was that you never want the side wall and front wall distance to be the same because you can either negatively or positively reinforce a bass mode by doing that. So like at 5 foot, you're basically 55 hertz, you'd be at a quarter wavelength. So I would expect at 5 feet, you're going to have either negative or positive reinforcement with a mode doing that. But, this is what I've read, and I've just always done it. I never really tested the theory, to be honest.
Okay,
I find that interesting.
the answer to that is I use a subsat system where the satellite speakers placed as I suggested don't put out much bass response. I use the subwoofers for that. So the bass problem with speakers the same distances doesn't apply.
Okay. No, interesting. And there was something else. Oh yeah, with my experiments with diffusion in multiple rooms, I may have misunderstood you, but like the broadband diffusion behind the listening position tends to push the soundstage back behind the speakers farther, in my experience. And I've done that in several rooms. It didn't make it seem smaller by any stretch, but I use broadband diffusers that are diffused from anywhere from 150 to 300 hertz all the way up to 18K. So, that makes a difference. But anyway, again, Gary, I thank you very much. It was very informative. I'm going to play with my surround a little bit more now. You motivated me to do that.
Okay, I also want to add for AJ's benefit and maybe a lot of people that have been here, I have deviated a little bit and pulled my left and right speakers further toward me by 2 feet. So now instead of 5 feet out, I have them 7. And I did that just for the hell of it, for wanting to get more diffusion behind them and to see if a little bit more direct from them would help anything. And I like it. So that's a difference from what you have heard if you've been here.
So they're 5 feet out from the side wall, but 7 feet out from the front wall?
Yes. Got
Whole new theory.
some more diffusion going around too.
All righty, interesting. Joe? You're muted, Joe.
Yes, I have two questions. I saw in your diagram that you had 7 little diamonds that were representing the reflections of the room, 4 in the back and 2 on the sides. If I was to draw 8 diamonds, 20 diamonds, 100 diamonds around those speakers as reflection points. Would I be wrong?
No,
Well, you know, that leads me to say, why is those 6 diamonds important? Because you actually went through your talk about, you know, how important each diamond is. The fact of the matter is, though, there is multiple amount of reflections that are coming not only from those spots, but even from behind the listener.
right,
And
and that's what
definitely from the sides. So all
that's
of
what
those
diffusion
have
achieves,
to be
isn't it?
taken into account.
I'm just showing the primary reflections from a perfectly reflective surface where they would be without diffusion and et cetera, et cetera.
Okay, my next question is this. I've owned Bose 901s. That was the first speakers I ever owned. And I've had direct reflecting speakers, omnidirectional speakers, polydirectional speakers, whatever you want to call them, for 30, 40 years in my sound room. What I came to realize was, why do you feel that you could create an acoustic space with direct reflection speakers and apply them to every single recording, which already has a certain amount of information in it if omnidirectional speakers are made? I'm talking about an acoustical recording now that uses omnidirectional microphones that already has that ambient information built into that already. Now you're creating an ambient sound field around that, around your, in your particular room, and you're applying that to every single recording. What makes that right?
I'm just placing the sounds where they should be in my room, and that is not coming straight from the 2 loudspeakers.
But when you said you're replacing them where they should be, I mean, who determined that? Was it the recording engineer? Was it the microphone? Was it you? Is it the room? I mean, what does that mean?
Well, look at your room as a canvas or a palette on which to paint the recorded sounds. Some of the recorded sounds are direct sound, right? Straight from the instruments. Some are deep and wide reflected sounds if they were recorded in a live recording. And those need to be presented from deep and wide in your room. If they were presented from the same 2 points in space as the direct field, they would sound very flat and forward, wouldn't they?
But isn't that ambience built into the recording already? Why do you feel like you have
Yes,
to
but it
create
has
more
to
of
be
it?
reconstructed on playback.
But you're taking the direct, you're taking the direct now. You said that there's different reflection patterns. Now you're taking the direct pattern that comes directly to your ears. Then you're saying some instruments are direct instruments, like a trumpet, for instance, with more directional than a drum or a guitar or something like that. And you're taking that direct instrument that has no reflection and you're reflecting it in the back. You're creating an ambience to an instrument that doesn't naturally have that kind of ambience.
Let me just tell you the effect of doing all this. If you have a recording like we were talking about rock recordings or Kraftwerk or Pink Floyd or something like that, it has no ambience in it naturally, and you play that on such a system as mine, what it sounds like is those instruments are playing right within your room. If you hopefully take a live recording of an orchestra in a real space, it'll place those recorded reflections from the real space from where they should be coming from in your room. You have a combination of effects going on at the same time. And it's hard to explain, but it's very audible.
I just don't understand why you would feel that that's true, because you're not taking those particular reflections or that ambient information and reflecting it in the back. You're taking all the information and reflecting it to the back. So you're basically, if you got a horn that, or any instruments that's a very directional instrument, and you're reflecting them in the back, you're blurring that image. and it's not a natural image for that instrument. Okay, so you're saying that I need to create an ambient space in my room, and I'm going to create it the way it makes the recording sound more natural. And you're applying that to every single recording. I lived with direct reflectional speakers my whole life, and I know that if I attempted to get a specific sound on a recording, that I knew what that recording was, by creating an ambient space in my room, I didn't necessarily duplicate that recording. I created a sound that's very different than the recording. I might like it better, or my room might like it better, but I don't see how that could be any closer to the recording when you're taking the ambience and the direct sound and you're splashing it all over the room.
Well, I don't see how you take an orchestral recording that had all kinds of ambience in it, and you're reproducing it from 2 points in space, and you're doing that to all of your recordings, how that can work.
Well, I never said that was right. I never said that. I never said that that was right.
Well,
Okay.
we are all doing
And that has its own issues. But I'm saying you're creating an ambient space that is not natural to that recording, and you're telling us that this is really more like what the recording was supposed to sound like.
We are all doing that, and we're making a choice.
Let me interject here for a moment, Jim. I've got an interesting proposition. I don't know if we could do it. And that would be, we can't bring Gary's room and setup to our homes, but we could theoretically have somebody bring a pair of speakers and a separate setup to Gary's room and do a comparison using the same recordings played back on a standard 2-channel setup in his room versus his setup. That could be a very interesting experiment.
That is interesting. Yes, absolutely.
Maybe with somebody we can work on that as a meeting. I would definitely want to attend that. And the fact of the matter is, Gary, I've heard your system a number of times. I think it lends itself extremely well for large orchestral type presentations, less so for more intimate type recordings. So I think that it is recording and genre specific, as all of our systems are. It probably has some limitations. It may enhance the sound of some types of music and potentially detract from others. But if we could do a side-by-side comparison in your room, I think that'd be fascinating to really tease out the differences.
Okay, I've got my speakers on wheels.
You can leave them there. Actually, we'll just put speakers alongside of them, and we're on top of them.
Well, the speakers should be in the same position as mine are.
Yeah.
But
well, not necessarily, because again, we're not necessarily trying to recreate that exact reflection, but rather compare what happens with your setup versus the standard setup. Food for thought. AJ and then John.
A lot to go back on here, but I had proposed that very same thing with Gary years ago, that I would bring a pair of speakers like I make, which are called variable directivity speakers, which can be both forward radiating or omni or whatever radiation pattern I want in the same speaker. You guys have heard my speakers at the shows. I go through the different presets, and I can change it from direct sound, which sounds more like Joe speakers or other mic speakers, because they are direct radiating, a horn tweeter and a woofer, or a dome tweeter and a woofer. But then I can switch it to a more omni type mode, more like an MBL or a Gary speaker. The difference being is that I can switch it. And just like Alan said, that we've all heard Gary's system, and on large scale orchestral pieces where he's pointing out where all those reflections are going to hit the walls, and it's going to make it sound much larger than the room. Yes, it does. And that's precisely what an omni or non-monopole type speaker does, a dipole, and again, omni type speakers. But when you want to listen to a solo singer guitar, that type of system completely falls apart, because it's not supposed to have that many strong reflections in room overwhelming the direct sound. So in essence, what Gary did when he moved the speakers out from the wall is that he increased the direct to reflection ratio. The direct sound was a higher ratio, the reflected sound was a lower ratio. It attenuated the reflected sound intensity, etc. And so, yes, it should have a bit more solid imaging while maintaining some of the largeness of the presentation, because there is a lot of sound coming off of the back. But again, that's not a switchable situation unless Gary's going to jump up every song and twiddle with the attenuators. That's not going to work so great. Whereas, like I said, I saw these types of back and forths on audio forums 20 plus years ago, and I used to laugh at it because that's exactly what I was doing. I was making variable directivity speakers, and I was trying to point out that there is no one directivity that's good for all recordings. That was the link that I sent earlier. You remember, Alan, the AES link? There's an entire section of the AES about speaker directivity. And the very clear answer there is that there isn't a perfect directivity for loudspeakers. That the perfect loudspeaker actually would have variable directivity, and the perfect listening room would actually have variable acoustics. Floyd Tooth says that in his book, by the way. He said, it'll never happen, but ideally you would have both a variable directivity loudspeaker and variable acoustics in the room, which I guess with modern day, what do you call it, where, automation,
DSP?
all that stuff. It would, no. There's that.
Oh, physical movement.
That is correct. That if you want to spend enough on your house, you can have movable shades and rotatable walls and all that sort of craziness, like what he was experimenting with so-called home automation. There are companies that would probably come in and say, all right, the drapes will slide back and forth on your sidewalls if you wanted to kill this. You could do it, but I think that's a bit of an extreme. And so I stick with what I do, which is I build a diffusion into the speaker. There's no need to put diffusion on the wall when the speaker is actually putting out diffuse sound backwards, which is ideally what you would want in any kind of semi-reflective space that a recording was made in, or a recording or a band would have been playing in, like a small jazz club, a concert hall, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So right now I have a pair of speakers that are forward radiating and true omni. And it is interesting to switch back and forth on it when playing back the same recordings. Even a classical recording, what it sounds like, Gary, is more of when you're in a concert hall and you sit way to the back, you're getting a lot more reflected. You're getting the Bose sound, the 70% reflections, maybe 30 or more. And the orchestra just sounds much more diffuse and distant, et cetera, et cetera. But if you sat on the front row, right in front of the orchestra, well, it's the opposite. You're getting primarily direct sound. You're getting very little reflected sound. And switching between direct and the omni reminds me very much of where you are in a concert hall relative to the players playing. So that's another aspect that we didn't really talk about, is for any quote unquote performance, not everybody's going to hear it because you're in different parts of the room. You could be way in the back, you could be way in the forward, you could be off to the side. And so even the live standard is not a standard, because it really comes down to where were you when you heard it? Were you in the back? Were you in the middle? Were you in the, so anyway, that was my 2 cents.
None of us want to have to fiddle with all those variables when you're selecting a recording, do we? We want to put the damn thing on and listen to it in our system.
I have a remote, Gary. A remote with 3 buttons, 1, 2, 3. And I switch depending on if I'm listening to a rock recording. I just go to direct sound. I have an intermediate mode where there's a bit of rear output, but it's overwhelmingly direct output. And so that can enhance, even rock recordings can sound a bit more spacious, et cetera. But then there's the full-blown omni mode. So there's 3 that I use, and I sure as heck use them on different types of recordings. And anyone who has actually had my speakers in their room for long periods of times, I've sold quite a few of these types of systems, would never go back to a conventional loudspeaker, ever. Having had that kind of.
Maybe we can work that out, AJ, where you could bring those to Gary's and we could have a shootout. That'd be fantastic.
I've been
You guys
asking him
talk.
for that for a long
Yeah.
time, but that's on
Okay.
Gary. I think he was having, I think his wife was having health issues, et cetera, and he really couldn't host a meet, et cetera, et cetera. But I don't know if the situation has changed where he could. I would be more than happy to bring a speaker designed specifically for Gary's room, because they would sit on top of his speakers. So they'd be spatially in the same position as his left and right speaker. And I'd make it so that the speaker is not very tall. It sits directly above where his speaker would be. So there wouldn't be an elevation big difference to where you would instantly go, oh yeah, that one's playing, that one's, because of the elevation.
All right, I'm
I
calling
can do
you
that.
out, AJ.
That'd be cool. We'll
I
start
can, like
selling
I say, I
tickets for
can
that
move
meeting.
my speakers now so that we can replace mine with yours and then play the thing again. And
That'd be
No,
interesting.
no, you don't have to touch your speaker. That was the entire point, Gary. My speakers would sit directly on top of yours wherever they are, and that would be it. You don't touch your speakers.
They're
That was
kind
my
of
whole
on a,
point.
they're on a rickety stand on some wheels on a cart, and I wouldn't want to do that.
Your
can
current
work it out.
speakers are?
Yeah,
I thought they were stand types. I mean, floor speakers, which they were when we were there. Did you change speakers?
there's 3 up front, and they
Yes.
are on the left and right are on a cart, so that I can experiment with positioning a little bit. I'm
Well,
done
we'll dump
experimenting,
the
but
cart for this experiment.
yeah, I just can't lift them. That's all.
Okay, we'll work that out, guys. John and then Mike.
Okay, so if the recordings are so variable, what AJ is saying is exactly right. How do you not vary your system if the recordings are so variable to try to get the best sound? I have a bass floor control because all these recordings are so variable. Some have a lot of bass, some have a little bass, some have too much bass. And the problem is a lot of the recordings that I like when I was a kid, when I listened to, you know, rock and roll, whatever, jazz, when I was a kid, a lot of these recordings aren't that great and they don't have bass. So I can actually control the bass floor and make it very listenable. And then I also have filters that I can change back and forth. So my point here is if the recordings are that variable, the answer is that if you could do it with a remote, which I can too, well, AJ can too, then that would be the answer to a lot of the variability in the recordings. So that's one point I had. Another point I had is everybody likes reflections. Everyone's talking about how they hate reflections. I'll tell you right now, everybody here likes reflections because you have more reflections in the room. You have more reflected sound in your room when you're listening than direct sound. So, I mean, if we didn't like reflections and we just wanted to hear what the engineer wanted us to hear, which if you saw the slideshow, you know, there's arguments to that too. If you just wanted to hear it, then we would all go listen in an anechoic environment. You just go because there's no reflections. So then you're going to hear exactly what they thought you should hear because we're in an anechoic. Now, who's going to do that? Because it sounds like horrible. So the question is the direct sound from the speaker versus reflected sound, how much is better? Is more reflected sound better, like the Bose 901s or Gary's speakers, or is more direct sound better, like let's just say a monopole speaker, or a dipole? Now a dipole has louder direct sound and lower reflected sound. And I mean, as AJ said, I'm a dipole guy too, and I'm not saying one. You know, you should like either way. You're gonna find what you like, but the whole question is direct sound versus reflected sound. How much of each? So I'm a proponent. You definitely want more direct sound, more louder, and the reflection should kind of add the ambience to the room. If you look at some of David Griesinger's papers that he wrote, he did studies on concert halls, and this is exactly what he went into. And AJ knows the studies I'm talking about. He compared to how much direct sound, and what he compared what halls were the best halls and why they were the best halls. Why these people paid all this money to go to Europe to sit into a hall. Because it's really the hall that gets the sound, and the only reason it's the hall that gets the sound is because it's a ratio of direct versus reflected sound. So now, if I want more reflected sound, I'm going to go to the last row in the hall, and I'm going to get more reflected. Now, who's going to want to sit there rather than, let's say, maybe, I don't know, 20th row center, right? Because you're going to get more.
You don't really need to go that far back, John. Any seat that's more than 19 feet away from the stage is in the primarily reverberant field.
But you want to hear the hall, but how much? What I'm trying to say is, you want to sit front row? Probably not. Where is the best sound? Well, you know how to prove where the best sound is? Where they get the money for the seats. Okay. And usually, and I saw a lot of these halls. That's where they get the money. In Griesinger's paper, it was like the 20th row. Center is great, but even off to the right a little bit's fine. But that's where they pay the most money for the hall, and there's a combination of more direct sound there versus reflected sound as you go back in the hall. Now, Gary, if you like the reflected versus more reflected sound than direct sound, that's fine. You might want to sit in the back of a hall to have that. There's nothing wrong with that either. There's nothing wrong with the person that wants to sit in the front row and get all the direct sound and not really hear the hall that much. So I don't think there's a wrong and a right here. I think it's a preference.
A good balance.
Yeah.
Yeah, very interesting. And before I get to Mike and then AJ, I'm going to throw out a different perspective is when it comes to classical music. I have tickets for the Florida Orchestra that we attend. My wife is not a big classical music fan. We have our regular seats at the Mahaffey where we go is probably about the 18th row, maybe the 15th row center, which I love. She doesn't care for classical music so much because she's more visual oriented than auditory focused. And we swapped seats, and Friday we were at the Straws for the Enigma variations, and we got box seats off to the side, way off to the side, second tier up. And she loved it because she could see the musicians, and the whole combination of the music and watching the musicians made it a more fulfilling experience for her. So when it comes to classical music, that's another element, the visual aspect. It also has to be taken into consideration. If you're not sitting in the sweet spot, and not everybody can sit in the sweet spot, and yet it can still be enjoyable to hear that music. Even rock concerts and even jazz, if you're way off axis live, it oftentimes sounds excellent. So it doesn't have to be optimal sitting in the room, but the whole experience that makes it meaningful. Okay, Mike, you're up.
Okay, so what I want to speak to now is specifically studio produced rock and roll. Let's call it fake music for lack of a better. It's all done in an environment that is not live. Okay, so I'm a visual artist. That's what I do for a living. So when I paint under full spectrum light. If someone takes my painting and they display it in their house and they don't use full spectrum light, they aren't seeing the painting in the correct way. So they're seeing it how maybe they prefer a red light on the painting. Maybe they prefer a purple light on the red, but it's not right because it was painted in full spectrum light and it needs to be shown in full spectrum light. So when you have a recording, a rock and roll recording or whatever that's done in a studio and mixed down with two direct reflecting speakers at the engineer's head, that's how it should be reproduced. And if you want to get the room reflections in and all that stuff, you're augmenting what is there. You're not reproducing. And I understand what John says, right? It varies all up and down. But the constant of the thing is that there are two direct reflecting speakers that are used. So if you stick to that base level of what that's how that music should be reproduced. Anything you do to that, other than that, is some sort of coloration that you prefer, but not exactly how it should be listened to. That's my point. Come at me.
I wanted Mike to come over and be my witness for my latest system to give me some support, but I haven't had anybody over lately, and the invitation is still open.
Wearing headphones will eliminate the room and the reflections for the most part.
It's correct, and that sounds wonderful as well. A lot of mix down is done with headphones too, believe it or not. So when they're dealing with the finite details and stuff, they will work with headphones. But in the end, the final mix is always done with two monitors, direct reflecting, that are generally pointed right at the engineer's head. So, and that's, like I said, I'm only speaking to rock and roll records and the stuff that's multi-tracked and all that other stuff. I'm not talking about live recordings or anything like that. So, and Gary, I'd be glad to come over, but I got a feeling I won't like all that loose music floating around the room. So
Okay. That's why you need to come over.
By the way, Mike, King Charles' portrait has to be viewed in red lights, in infrared only.
And is that because he painted it? It was painted in infrared, or because they don't want it to be destroyed by the natural light?
He must have painted it in infrared.
Oh, you're talking about King Charles. I got that.
That's right.
You know, I actually like that portrait. So
I think that was a joke.
One of the few people. I'm one of the few people. Yeah, well, I got it now. I was thinking he was going way back. Something. I know I got it now.
I can literally go get one of your pieces and change the lighting in front of me if you want to show the differences. I mean, it's very obvious. I don't have high CRI lights here, but these are some of the filming lights that I use. And I mean, literally throughout the year, I will change color temperature so that I don't look as pasty white as I actually am. Lighting for art is just as important as, you know, a room treatment would be for sound. So
very interesting analogy. Yeah, we can all understand that. Okay, AJ and then Joe.
Well, a lot of the discussion about reflections are more intuition than science. The fact of the matter is that no matter how many reflections are recorded in the recording, the human ear can easily distinguish between a recorded reflection and a real reflection in a room. So people say, well, you know, the recording has all the reflections, so we don't want any extra reflections in the room because then that's going to color. That's nonsense. That's perceptual nonsense. Science says different. Science says you take those same people who say that, and then you test them and you remove all the reflections and have them play back whatever recording they think should have no reflections. And then you add or remove the removal of reflections in order to allow for reflections, and they overwhelmingly prefer it. Even mixing and mastering engineers have been shown in blind tests to prefer reflections in a real room for playback, not for mixing, not for mastering, but when playing back like we all do on our stereos. Even mixing and mastering engineers in blind tests where they can't tell what they're listening to prefer reflective environments. So, and the answer is very simple. The human ear can easily distinguish between recorded reflections and real reflections. And real reflections tend to add a semblance of space, even if it's a rock recording or you know, a recording that's not a classical concert hall type thing. It's still preferred by the vast majority of people to have some reflections in the room. It doesn't have to be overwhelming, not quite Gary level, but anechoic. If you listen to that recording in an anechoic chamber, which is absence of all reflections, sounds horrible to the vast majority of people. So some reflections are preferred by the vast majority of people. And then let's not forget, we're listening in stereo. So we have acoustic interference between the two speakers. We have reflections off the wall, and the acoustic interference between the two speakers creates coloration in of itself, that adding reflections back from the room reduce those colorations. Believe it or not, that's perceptual science reality, not audiophile intuition. So
mixed back rooms are never anechoic. They are LEDE almost every time, and so they don't work in an anechoic. I don't know if any of you have ever been in an anechoic chamber, but it's creepy. It's really creepy. I was in one out in Hollywood when they were mixing a DVD, and 96 decibels in that room. You can whisper to the person next to you and you can still hear it. You can hear the blood rushing through your body and bumping in your brain. It's very, very eerie. No one would want to listen to that unless you were mixing something for a movie soundtrack and you wanted to make sure that everything was at the same level and everything like that. That's when you would do that. But in a general recording space where you're recording music, the engineering rooms are never, ever anechoic. At least none of them I've been in. How about that?
Yeah, absolutely. All righty, Joe, and then John, and we're going to have to wrap it up. We're approaching 9 o'clock, 2 hours. So,
okay, I just wanted to speak about my own experience with this. Doing this for over 50 years and having probably omnidirectional, polydirectional speakers for 40 of those years. I think we all listen, and we all listen with different attitudes. I mean, sometimes we listen to our systems and we want critical listening, and sometimes we want to just enjoy the music. And sometimes we just want to listen to background music in an elevator. So it all depends on our moods, but there is no doubt that adding ambience, especially the Bose 901s, for instance, have 8 drivers, 8 4-inch drivers facing the back wall and 1 4-inch driver facing you. Well, there's no doubt about it that those 8 drivers in the back are compromising the detail that you're actually hearing, blurring the detail from the front driver, okay? The majority of the sound you're getting is ambient, is reflected sound. So I think there has to be a balance there. I think when reflected sound actually impinges on the detail and the accuracy of what an instrument sounds like, that's when it becomes detrimental to from an audiophile point of view. And when I realized that, because I'm not a classical music person, I don't like classical music. I've tried to listen to it. I don't like it. Never liked it. And basically I listen to small jazz ensembles mostly, and I do listen to some rock and roll, but as I get older, I'm less tolerant of listening to rock and roll. So I listen to smaller jazz ensembles, and vocals is probably the most important part of music to me. Okay. And when you start bouncing vocals around in the room, you blur the emotion of the person, you blur the pronunciation of what they're actually singing about. And that got to me. After 40 years, I had enough of it. And it didn't serve the kind of music that I was listening to. And that's why now I would never own an omnidirectional speaker, especially when you don't have control over how much ambience you're adding, like the Bose 901s, or like most omnidirectional speakers, where you really don't have control of how much ambience you want to put into a room. That's it.
Interesting perspective. Thank you, Joe. And John, I guess you get the last word, perhaps?
Oh, okay. All right. So it's just like the MVLs versus small mini monitors. It's a totally different sound, correct? But sometimes you can go to an audio show and go in that MBL room and go, wow, man. I mean, that sounded really good. Other times you can go in the mini monitor room and go, whoa, that thing is doing things that I never thought it couldn't do. So I think that you can enjoy both ways if it's done done right. If it's done right, I think you can listen to either highly reflected speakers or more direct reflected speakers, you know, because people can like two different types of speakers. And that's the cool part about it, is how many speakers are available that people need, you know, can buy. So it just shows you the variety. You know, there's not one thing that's going to please everybody. So that's what's so neat about this hobby. You know, it's like there's no, and that's what I kind of made a comment on there. So there's no wrong and no right. It's like whatever keeps you glued to your seat for the 3 hours, and have a knock on the door saying, "Dad, I got to go to bed," you know, because I have a 15-year-old, and that's cool. And I shut it right off when she says that. But so I think that part's cool. But one other thing too is I always hear do we want you are there or they are here? We've heard this, right? So to me, if there's a female vocalist, beautiful voice, and this, and I want they are here. I want them to be in the room with me, right? You kind of want that, just the closeness, you know, of the female vocal, to feel like the presence of it. But now, if I'm listening to a classical piece, which I do like classical, I want to be there. You know, I want the system to represent the ambience and the largeness and whatever that hall has to have. So that's the challenge, of course, for everybody, is to try to get those two opposite things.
All right, everybody. Thank you, Gary, John, and everybody else for your shared perspectives. I guess we've learned there are many ways to skin the audiophile cat, so to speak. And each of us should take some time, I think, to, if you'll pardon the pun, reflect on the discussion tonight and think about, you know, what we like. Ultimately, it's all about what we enjoy, the presentation we enjoy, but understanding and appreciating there's more than one way to get to the end point. And I'm really looking forward if we can work out a way to have AJ bring his speakers over to Gary's and have a live versus Memorex or a shootout between the two approaches, and switch the degree of reflections and hear the impact with various types of music, various genres. I think that'll be very enlightening.
Thank you,
Again,
Alan.
thank you everybody for the
Thank you, Alan.
comments.
I think
was
I'm going to
great.
save some money on room treatment.
Yeah, this was fantastic. This was fantastic. I enjoyed the heck out
Yeah, it
of
was
it.
good. It was very
Thank you.
good.
Appreciate it.
A lot of
And
fun.
like I said, I recorded this and I'll edit it slightly, and hopefully it might be, in fact, I'm going to stop the recording now. Again, thank you everybody for sticking here to the end. We'll do it again sometime.